At 19 years old, I stood barefoot on a cracked sidewalk in Savannah, Georgia, holding a wrinkled $20 bill like it was proof of my failure. My husband, Derek Lawson, leaned against the apartment doorway behind me, smiling as if he had just won something. Not an argument. Not a fight. My life. You'll be back in a week, he said, almost gently. You don't survive out there without me. He tossed my clothes into a black trash bag. My textbooks followed. Then the door shut. What he didn't know, what no one in his family knew, was that I wasn't afraid of being broke. I was afraid of becoming exactly what they expected me to be, and that fear would become the most expensive mistake he ever made. When I married Derek at 18, I thought I was escaping something worse. My childhood in rural Alabama had been tight with rules and silence. Marrying a confident, older man with a steady job in his family's construction business felt like freedom. Savannah felt like a fresh start. At first, Derek was attentive, protective. He liked introducing me as my beautiful young wife. But protection slowly turned into management. Then management turned into control. He handled all the money. Said it was easier that way. When my paychecks from the small boutique job I briefly had came in, he deposited them into what he called our account. I never saw statements. If I needed cash, I asked. You don't have to worry about numbers, he would say with a smile. That's my job. The first time I noticed something was off. I tried to buy groceries with our debit card and it was declined. I stood there, 19, cheeks burning under fluorescent lights, while the cashier waited. When I asked Derek that night, he shrugged. I switched some things around, he said. It's simpler if the account's just in my name. Just like that. No discussion. I told myself it was temporary. That marriage meant compromise. But what I never told him was that I had applied to nursing school. The idea had been growing quietly inside me. Every time I drove past Coastal Regional Medical Center, I felt something pull at me. Stability. Purpose. Independence. I didn't want glamour. I wanted a license with my name on it. A career no one could threaten. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Cream envelope. My hands trembled when I opened it. I had been accepted into the community college nursing program starting that fall. For a few hours, I let myself imagine a different future. Derek found the letter before I could hide it. He was standing in the kitchen when I walked in from the bedroom. The envelope lay open on the counter. His jaw was tight. You think you're better than this family? He asked quietly. It's just school, I said. I can work and go to class. It won't change anything. It changes everything, he snapped. No wife of mine is going to act like she's too good for what we built. What we built? As if I had built anything at all. His phone buzzed on the counter. A message lit up from his mother. Handle it before she ruins everything. I saw it. He saw that I saw it. Something hardened in his expression. The argument didn't last long. It didn't need to. He moved with cold efficiency, pulling my clothes from the closet, shoving them into trash bags. My shoes, my notebooks, the framed wedding photo from the dresser, all of it crammed together like disposable things. Derek, stop, I said once. He didn't. He slipped my wedding ring off my finger. Not violently, just firmly. He set it on the kitchen counter like it was a receipt. Then he folded a $20 bill and pressed it into my palm. This should cover the bus when you come crawling back, he said. You won't last a week. There was no screaming. No neighbors watching. Just the hollow echo of the door closing behind me. As I walked down the stairs, dragging the trash bag behind me, I saw his father standing near the parking lot. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't concerned. He looked satisfied. That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't a fight. It was a decision. When I reached the sidewalk, I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking. But not from fear. From clarity. I tried to buy a bus ticket online. My card was declined. Again. He had already cut off access. I sat down on a bench outside a closed laundromat, the humid Georgia air pressing against my skin. I stared at the $20 in my hand. Call your parents, I thought. But going back there would mean admitting they were right about everything. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts and stopped on a name Derek used to roll his eyes at. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, retired hospital administrator, widow. The woman who once told me, during a volunteer shift, that I asked too many good questions to waste my life. I pressed call. She answered on the third ring. I opened my mouth to explain, but she spoke first. Are you safe? She asked calmly. Yes, I whispered. There was a pause. Then she said, come over. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need details. As I stood up, lifting that trash bag again, I realized something Derek never understood about me. I wasn't afraid of starting over. I was afraid of staying small. Mrs. Evelyn Harper opened the door before I had the chance to knock a second time. The porch light cast a soft glow across her silver hair, and for a moment I must have looked like exactly what I felt like, a child pretending to be a grown woman, holding a trash bag full of clothes and a pride that had nowhere to sleep. She didn't ask what happened. She stepped aside and said, come in. Her house smelled like lavender and old books. It was small but steady, the kind of place that had survived storms. I stood in her hallway, suddenly aware of how loud my breathing sounded. On the wall beside me hung a framed newspaper clipping. I had seen it once before but never really read it. Local hospital administrator resigns amid board dispute. Her name was printed beneath the headline. You can put your things in the guest room, she said gently. Then you can tell me as much or as little as you want. I sat at her kitchen table an hour later, a mug of chamomile tea warming my hands, and told her everything. The nursing school letter, the argument, the $20, the locked bank account. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me. They didn't throw you out because you're weak, she said quietly. They threw you out because you're inconvenient. The word settled into my chest. Inconvenient. She offered me the guest room for as long as I needed it. As long as you're building, she added, not hiding. The next morning, I started looking for work. Within a week, I was juggling 2 jobs, mornings at a diner near River Street, pouring coffee for tourists who never remembered my name, evenings cleaning office buildings downtown, moving silently through glass corridors after everyone else had gone home. In between, I enrolled in community college and secured emergency financial aid to begin nursing school that fall. I filled out paperwork in the campus advising office with hands that no longer trembled. Derek began texting on the 3rd day. Still alive. Need a ride home yet? Each message carried the same smug certainty. One afternoon, while I was on break behind the diner, another message came through. It was a photo of our old apartment. Fresh paint. New curtains. Some things are easy to replace, he wrote. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I deleted the message. What he didn't know was that I had taped the $20 bill inside the back cover of my anatomy notebook. Not as a reminder of humiliation. As fuel. A week later, something shifted. While cleaning one of the downtown office buildings, I passed a familiar logo etched into frosted glass. Lawson & Sons Construction. My stomach tightened. The door was slightly open. Light still on inside. I wasn't supposed to linger. But as I moved past with my cleaning cart, voices drifted into the hallway. Derek's father. If she pushes back on the loan, we shift liability before the audit. My name followed. Clear. Sharp. I froze. Derek's voice came next. Lower than usual. What if she talks to a lawyer? She won't, his father replied. She doesn't have the money. The word audit echoed in my mind. I stepped back quietly, heart pounding so loudly I was certain they could hear it through the walls. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I had heard enough to know this wasn't just about a failed marriage. It was strategy. That night, I told Evelyn what I had heard. She went very still when I mentioned coastal medical expansion, the hospital project they were discussing. It was the same hospital where I would be doing my clinical rotations. I refused to approve a contract with them years ago. she said softly. Documentation didn't align with inspection reports. And then, I asked. And then I was encouraged to resign. The newspaper clipping on her wall made more sense now. Did Derek ever have you sign anything you didn't fully read? She asked carefully. I thought about the stack of papers he had placed in front of me months earlier. Business equipment financing. Just routine. He had said, "Sign here." My stomach dropped. The next day, I pulled my credit report for the first time in my life. There it was. A business credit card. Nearly maxed out. An equipment loan tied to Lawson & Sons. My name attached. The signature on the scanned document looked like mine, but not quite. The angle was wrong. The tail on the H in Hannah too sharp. I texted Derek, "Why is there a loan in my name?" His response came quickly. "You were my wife." That's what wives do. I felt something inside me change then. Not break. Harden. A certified letter arrived 3 days later. Late payments. Risk of escalation. If the company fell, I would fall with it. I sat at Evelyn's kitchen table again. The letter spread open between us. "If you want revenge," she said quietly. "Build power." Quietly. I thought about marching into that office and demanding answers. I thought about screaming. Instead, I registered for an extra shift at the diner. I began documenting everything. Screenshots. Dates. Conversations. Copies of paperwork. At my first nursing clinical rotation, I stood in the hallway of Coastal Regional Medical Center wearing borrowed scrubs and a plastic badge with my name printed in black ink. Hannah Whitaker, student nurse. The corridors smelled of antiseptic and possibility. That weekend, back at the office building, I passed the Lawson & Sons door again. It was ajar. Inside, raised voices. I wasn't looking for secrets that night. But this time, when I heard my name, I stepped closer. I stopped my cleaning cart just short of the open door and held my breath. Inside the glass-walled conference room, Derek stood near the end of the table, his father at the head. Papers were spread out between them. The overhead lights were harsh, turning everything a flat, unforgiving white. "If she pushes back on the loan," his father said, tapping a document with 2 fingers. "We shift liability before the audit expands." My name followed. Clear. Deliberate. Derek ran a hand through his hair. "What if she talks to a lawyer?" "She won't," his father replied. "She doesn't have the money. And she doesn't have the backbone." I felt the words land, one by one. Backbone. Audit. Liability. This wasn't just about humiliating me. This was planning. I leaned slightly, just enough to see the folder on the edge of the table. Coastal Medical Expansion, Phase 2 was printed across the top in bold letters. My stomach tightened. Coastal Regional Medical Center. The hospital where I was now doing my clinical rotations. The place I walked into every week with borrowed confidence and a plastic badge. Their company was bidding on expansion contracts there. Permits can be backdated if necessary. Derek's father continued. "We've done it before. The compliance board doesn't dig unless someone points them in the right direction." "And if she does?" Derek asked. A pause. "Then we make sure she regrets it." Silence followed. I stepped back quietly before the floor beneath my shoes betrayed me. I pushed my cart forward, forcing myself to move at a normal pace down the hallway. My hands were steady. My pulse was not. When I got home, Evelyn was reading in the living room. She looked up once and knew something had shifted. "They're moving debt around," I told her. "And they're connected to Coastal's expansion." She closed her book slowly. "They tried to secure that contract years ago," she said. "I refused to approve it. The inspection reports didn't align with the paperwork. And that's when you resigned. I was encouraged to." The word hung between us. Encouraged. I pulled out the loan documents I had printed earlier that week and laid them across the coffee table. She adjusted her glasses and studied the signature carefully. "Look at the pressure marks," she said quietly. "That's not a natural flow." I leaned closer. The curve of the H was sharper than mine. The slant inconsistent. You think it's forged? I asked. I think, she said carefully, it deserves to be questioned. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and replayed every memory of signing paperwork during my marriage. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table while Derek stood over me, impatient. It's routine, he had said. Just business equipment. I had trusted him. The next morning, I called a local attorney Evelyn recommended. I didn't tell Derek. I didn't text him again. I didn't warn anyone. The lawyer reviewed the documents in silence. When were you served divorce papers? He asked. We were never officially divorced, I said. He threw me out. We separated. That's it. He nodded slowly. If this signature was placed after you were no longer residing together, and without your knowledge, that could constitute fraud. The word settled in my chest like a stone. Fraud. Outside the office. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. You're not wrong. Attached was a scanned PDF of inspection reports tied to Lawson & Sons projects. Several pages were marked with handwritten notes. One highlighted section referenced coastal medical expansion. Non-compliant structural documentation. The email address was unlisted. No signature. No name. Someone inside their world was watching too. At the diner that evening, Derek walked in. He spotted me immediately. I could see the surprise in his eyes when he realized I wasn't shrinking. He slid into a booth and waited until my shift ended. You've been asking questions? He said quietly in the parking lot. I've been reading documents with my name on them. He stepped closer. Be careful, Hannah. Audits can make people disappear financially. The threat was softer than shouting. More dangerous. I'm documenting everything, I said calmly. Every signature. Every date. For a flicker of a second, I saw uncertainty in his expression. You're overthinking this, he muttered. No, I said. I'm finally thinking. He walked away first. Back at Evelyn's house, I opened my laptop and began researching compliance regulations tied to public healthcare construction contracts, permit timelines, approval processes, liability standards. If they were cutting corners, it wasn't small. It was systemic. At my next clinical rotation, I stood in a hallway lined with patient rooms and watched nurses move with practiced precision. Monitors beeped steadily. Lives depended on infrastructure no one questioned once it was built. What if those walls were constructed on altered permits? What if the foundation itself was compromised? The thought made my stomach turn. That night, another email arrived. Subject line. Audit timeline moved up. Attached was an internal memo from Lawson & Sons referencing federal review of hospital construction contracts. At the bottom of the document, someone had written in red ink, "She deserves to know." I stared at the words for a long time. Someone inside their world was breaking ranks. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. They thought I was alone. I wasn't. 5 years later, I walked into the Lawson family home wearing a navy dress I had bought with my own paycheck. The house was bigger than I remembered. Or maybe I was smaller back then. Christmas lights wrapped around the columns. A towering tree glowed through the front window. The invitation had arrived a week earlier. Formal and strangely polite. As if we were distant acquaintances instead of something more complicated. It's time we put the past behind us. Derek's mother had written at the bottom. Evelyn had raised one eyebrow when I showed it to her. Go, she said. But go as the woman you've become. By then, I was 24. I had earned my RN license. I worked full-time at Coastal Regional Medical Center, rotating between surgical recovery and cardiac step-down. I paid my own rent. My name stood alone on my bank account. No one could lock me out of it. Derek opened the door. For a moment, he didn't recognize me. Not fully. His eyes traveled from my heels to my posture, to the badge clipped to my purse that read Coastal Regional Medical Center. Hannah, he said, almost cautiously. Derek. His wife appeared behind him before the silence could stretch too long. Camille was poised, perfectly styled, with a diamond bracelet that caught the light when she extended her hand. "It's nice to finally meet you," she said. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were assessing. The dining room was filled with extended family. Conversations paused when I entered. Not dramatically, just enough. "So this is the nurse," Derek's father said, lifting his glass. "We always knew you'd land on your feet." There was something almost admiring in his tone. Almost. During cocktails, I moved through the room carefully, listening more than speaking. Near the fireplace, Derek's father was boasting to two cousins about a major contract. "Coastal Regional Phase 3, he said proudly. "Biggest expansion yet." My hand tightened slightly around my glass. "Coastal Regional. My hospital. We've cleaned up compliance," he continued. "New systems. New oversight. No more surprises. No more surprises." At the dinner table, Derek made a joke about how some people think degrees make them important. Laughter followed. "Polite. Obligatory?" I smiled. "I think responsibility makes people important," I said evenly. Camille's fork paused midair. Later, in the kitchen while plates were being cleared, she approached me. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Of course." "Did Derek ever ask you to sign financial documents without really explaining them?" The question hung between us like a fragile ornament. "Yes," I said. Her expression didn't change much, but something behind her eyes shifted. "He's been restructuring parts of the company," she said carefully. "There's an audit review. Some contracts are under scrutiny." I thought about the anonymous emails, the highlighted inspection reports, the memo in red ink. "You should read everything," I told her, "line by line. And don't sign what you don't understand." She nodded slowly. Back at the table, Derek's father stood to make a toast. "To family," he said, lifting his glass. "And to loyalty. We're strongest when we stand united." His eyes lingered on me just a fraction too long. This dinner wasn't about reconciliation. It was about assessment. They wanted to know if I was still a liability, or if I had become something else. After dessert, Derek followed me into the hallway near the coat closet. "You've been quiet," he said. "I've been listening." He leaned closer. "Whatever you think you know about the audit, you don't." I didn't say I knew anything. "You don't want to get pulled into something bigger than you." I held his gaze. "You mean like a loan in my name?" His jaw tightened. "That was business," he said. "That was betrayal." For a second, the mask slipped. Not anger. Not arrogance. Fear. As I stepped outside into the cold December air, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Audit timeline moved up. Attached was a photo of bidding paperwork. Coastal Regional Medical Center logo visible at the top. Lawson & Sons listed as primary contractor for the next expansion phase. My pulse steadied instead of racing. If they secured that contract, their position would stabilize. Investors would relax. Scrutiny would fade. Inside the house, laughter drifted through the door. I thought about the 19-year-old version of me standing on a sidewalk with a trash bag and a $20 bill. I thought about the nurse badge in my purse, the hospital corridors, the patients who trusted the building to be safe. This was no longer about a marriage. It was about standards. As I drove away, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel humiliated. I felt aware. If I wanted real revenge, it wouldn't happen at their dinner table. It would happen at the boardroom table. The courier asked for my ID before handing me the envelope. I was halfway through a double shift at Coastal Regional when the front desk paged me. I walked down still in scrubs, thinking it was something routine. The man waiting in the lobby wore a neutral expression. The kind people practice when delivering bad news for a living. "Certified delivery?" he said. The envelope was thick. Official seal stamped in the corner. I knew before I opened it. Subpoena. My name printed in bold across the top. Lawson & Sons Construction listed beneath it. Civil court appearance required regarding financial liability tied to a commercial equipment loan. My vision narrowed for a moment, then cleared. Not shock. Recognition. They were moving pieces. The claim alleged shared responsibility for a construction equipment loan initiated during my marriage. The balance listed was high enough to ruin my credit permanently. Enough to make banks hesitate. Enough to keep someone small. The filing date caught my attention. 3 weeks after Derek threw me out, I stood in the hospital hallway, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and felt something cold settle inside me. I had not been living there. I had not signed anything. That evening, I sat in a lawyer's office downtown with the documents spread across a polished wooden desk. He adjusted his glasses and studied the signature carefully. "Did you sign this?" he asked. "No." He compared the dates to the separation timeline I provided. "This signature is dated after you were no longer residing together. If proven unauthorized, this isn't just a civil dispute. This could be fraud." Fraud. The word didn't frighten me. It steadied me. Outside, I leaned against my car and closed my eyes for a moment. I remembered Derek pressing that $20 bill into my hand. The certainty in his voice. The way he believed I would crawl back. Now he needed my silence. My phone rang that night. "Camille." Her voice sounded tight. "There's an expanded review," she said. "Auditors are looking at past hospital contracts. Investors are nervous. And the loan?" I asked. "I think he's trying to distribute liability," she admitted quietly. "He mentioned your name in a meeting." "Of course he did." "Camille," I said carefully. "Have you signed anything recently?" There was a pause. "He asked me to sign a restructuring agreement last month," she whispered. "I didn't." Something felt off. The pattern was unmistakable. Wives as buffers. Liability shields. I forwarded all documentation to my attorney and authorized him to file a formal response. We prepared a counterclaim alleging forged signature and financial coercion during the marriage. I hesitated before signing the authorization. Filing meant escalation. It meant the matter would no longer stay contained in quiet paperwork. But I had learned something over the past 5 years. Silence protects the wrong people. 2 days later, another anonymous email arrived. Subject line: "Look closer." Attached were internal ledger screenshots from Lawson & Sons. One entry clearly showed debt reassignment under my Social Security number after the documented separation date. There it was. Intent. Not accident. Not oversight. Deliberate. That evening, Derek waited outside the hospital parking garage. He looked different. The sharp confidence dulled at the edges. His suit was still expensive, but his posture was tighter. "We can settle this quietly," he said as I approached my car. "There's nothing to settle," I replied. "You don't want this public?" he insisted. "It hurts everyone." "Everyone?" I asked softly. He exhaled. "If this goes to court, the audit expands. Investors panic. The company collapses." And there it was. Not concern for me. Concern for the empire. "You should have thought about that before you signed my name," I said. "I didn't," he stopped himself. The denial never fully formed. For the first time, I saw it clearly. He was not the architect of power I once believed him to be. He was scrambling. "I won't destroy you," I said calmly. "But I won't carry you either." He stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. The next morning, the local business section published a short article. "Local construction firm under expanded financial review." Lawson & Sons named in the second paragraph. By afternoon, my attorney called. "They've requested forensic analysis of the loan documents," he said. "And the compliance board is coordinating with federal investigators." The word federal changed the temperature of the room. What had begun as a $20 humiliation was now a thread pulling at something much larger. That night, I opened my desk drawer and looked at the folded bill I had kept all these years. It no longer felt like an insult. It felt like a receipt. Derek had thought $20 would make me disappear. He never imagined I would become the reason everything surfaced. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and recycled air. 2 years had passed since the Christmas dinner, and I was no longer the 19-year-old standing on a sidewalk. I was 26 now. a clinical operations supervisor at Coastal Regional Medical Center, responsible for staffing schedules and compliance audits inside my own department. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I walked into the Savannah Civil Courthouse that morning, my heels echoed sharply against the tile. Derek was already seated at the defense table beside his attorney. His father sat one row behind him, rigid and unsmiling. For a split second, Derek looked up and our eyes met. He expected something. Mercy. Maybe. The clerk called the case. Lawson and Sons Construction versus Coastal County Compliance Board, with my name listed as a financially affiliated party due to the equipment loan. I took my seat calmly. My attorney leaned toward me. Stick to facts. No emotion. Emotion wasn't the problem. The judge entered, stern and efficient. Proceedings began with formal statements about irregularities discovered during an expanded audit tied to hospital construction contracts. Coastal Regional's expansion project was mentioned by name. I felt the weight of it. Lives would one day depend on those walls. When the equipment loan was introduced into the record, Derek's attorney attempted to frame it as routine marital financial cooperation. Mrs. Whitaker benefited from the company's success during her marriage, he argued. Shared liability is reasonable. Mrs. Whitaker. I almost smiled. Under oath. I stated my full name clearly. Hannah Whitaker. Then I laid out the timeline. The date I was thrown out. The date my access to joint accounts was removed. The date the loan was allegedly signed. The judge asked to see the original documents. Forensic analysis results were submitted. Signature inconsistencies. Pressure variance. Ink dating discrepancies. Derek shifted in his seat. His attorney's confidence faltered. Did you authorize this loan? The judge asked me directly. No, I said evenly. Did you have knowledge of it at the time it was executed? No. Silence filled the room in a way that felt heavy, not empty. Compliance Board representatives presented additional evidence regarding permit backdating tied to Lawson and Sons projects. Internal emails, timeline inconsistencies, safety documentation that did not align with inspections. Derek's father attempted to attribute errors to clerical oversight. The judge did not appear impressed. During a recess, Derek approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. You didn't have to go this far, he said quietly. I didn't, I replied. You did. He exhaled sharply. If the company collapses, it hurts a lot of people. You mean investors, I said. You're being vindictive. I held his gaze. No, I'm being honest. For the first time, there was no smirk, no superiority, only strain. Back inside, the judge issued an interim ruling. The loan would be removed from my liability pending criminal review of potential forgery. Lawson and Sons would face temporary suspension from bidding on publicly funded projects until compliance concerns were resolved. Temporary suspension. In construction tied to public health care, temporary could be fatal. Derek's shoulders dropped as the words were spoken. The gavel came down. Outside the courthouse, Camille stood across the street. She didn't approach him. She didn't approach me. She simply watched, her expression unreadable. By the time I returned to the hospital the next day, word had spread quietly through administrative channels. Vendor review processes were being tightened. Compliance committees were forming. Within weeks, federal investigators expanded the review beyond the original audit. Lawson and Sons was now under broader scrutiny. I focused on my work. Staffing shortages, budget meetings, policy revisions. The more responsibility I took on inside the hospital, the less emotional weight Derek's name carried. One evening, I received a voicemail. It was Derek. You didn't just survive. Did you? He said. His voice was lower than I remembered. You built something. I didn't call back. Instead, I stayed late in my office reviewing operational metrics for the upcoming quarter. On the bulletin board behind my desk hung a printed copy of the hospital's expansion blueprint. Phase 3. The same project his father had once boasted about at Christmas. If approved, it would reshape the facility for decades. The board had announced plans to create a new director of operations role to oversee the expansion process and vendor selection. Applications would open in 6 months. I looked at my reflection in the darkened office window. The 19-year-old version of me would have been trembling. The 26-year-old version was calculating. He had believed power was loud, controlling, immediate. I was beginning to understand something different. Power was patient, and I had just begun to learn how to use it. 8 years after the courtroom hearing, I sat at the head of a polished boardroom table reviewing bids for the largest expansion in Coastal Regional's history. I was 34. Director of Operations. My name engraved on a brushed steel plate outside a corner office. I had earned 1 audit, 1 policy revision, 1 sleepless quarter at a time. The expansion included a new surgical wing, an oncology center, and an upgraded emergency department. Public funding was involved. Compliance oversight was tight. Every contractor had been screened twice before their proposals even reached my desk. I flipped to the final folder in the stack. Lawson Infrastructure Group. The name had changed. The ownership structure had shifted. But the managing partner listed inside was unmistakable. Derek Lawson. For a moment, I simply stared at the page. Not in shock. Not in anger. In recognition, he had survived the investigation. Rebranded. Reorganized. Quiet settlements instead of convictions. Investors who believed in second chances. I closed the folder gently and scheduled the formal bid presentations. Before the meeting, I disclosed my prior marital connection to legal counsel and the board chair. Everything documented. Transparent. No conflict of interest if evaluation remains merit-based. Counsel confirmed. I signed the disclosure without hesitation. Presentation day arrived. Contractors lined the hallway outside the boardroom. Portfolios in hand, suits pressed. Confidence rehearsed. When Derek walked in, he carried himself with careful control. Older, sharper around the edges. The arrogance muted but not erased. He didn't recognize me immediately. Not until introductions began. Director Hannah Whitaker. The board chair said, gesturing toward me. Derek's expression shifted mid-step. Not dramatically. Just enough. He recovered quickly, offering a professional nod. The presentation began. He spoke about restructuring, about lessons learned, about compliance reforms and internal audits. He emphasized transparency, competitive pricing, and commitment to community health. He avoided specifics about subcontractor documentation. When it was my turn to ask questions, I kept my voice calm. Can you clarify environmental clearance documentation for your subcontractor in Fulton County last year? A flicker crossed his face. That issue was resolved, he said carefully. Resolved how? I asked. Silence stretched a fraction too long before his attorney stepped in with a technical explanation. Board members scribbled notes. I asked about insurance coverage limits, about contingency planning, about prior permit discrepancies flagged in compliance reviews. He answered each question, but the Polish felt thinner now. After the formal session ended, he waited in the hallway. Can we talk? He asked. I stepped aside into a smaller conference room. The glass walls reflected both of us back at ourselves. This contract would stabilize everything, he said quietly. We've rebuilt. We've corrected past mistakes. This decision isn't personal, I replied. He gave a short laugh. It's impossible for it not to be. It's not, I said evenly. He hesitated before continuing. Cash flow is tight. Investors are watching this bid closely. Without it, expansion plans shrink. Staff layoffs happen. The words were measured. Strategic. He was appealing to responsibility. You're asking me to overlook risk, I said. I'm asking you to consider growth. I replied. For the hospital. His jaw tightened slightly. You've done well, he said after a pause. Better than I expected. There it was. The echo of the sidewalk. The smirk. The $20. I didn't build this to impress you, I said calmly. Board deliberations began that afternoon. Compliance officers presented risk assessments. Financial analysts compared long-term liability projections. Environmental clearance documentation from Lawson Infrastructure contained minor inconsistencies that required additional review. The competing firm presented a cleaner record. Lower exposure. Stronger transparency history. The room fell quiet. All eyes turned toward me for final recommendation. I slid the evaluation summary across the table. Based on documented compliance history, risk exposure, and long-term fiscal responsibility, I said steadily, I recommend awarding the contract to Northbridge Development. No tremor in my voice. No satisfaction in the decision. Just clarity. The vote was taken. Motion passed. When the meeting adjourned, Derek remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood and approached slowly. Was this about revenge? He asked. No, I said. This was about standards. He held my gaze, searching for something. Anger, regret, cruelty. He found none. As he turned to leave, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Finality. The power he once used to corner me now rested quietly in my hands. And this time, it wasn't emotional. It was institutional. The room emptied slowly after the vote. Papers were gathered. Chairs pushed back. Polite handshakes exchanged. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, I watched contractors file down the hallway carrying portfolios that suddenly felt heavier. Derek remained seated until nearly everyone had left. When he finally stood, he didn't rush toward me. He walked with controlled steps, like a man trying to preserve dignity that had already slipped. Was it revenge? He asked again once we were alone. His voice was quieter than I remembered. Not the sharp edge that once cut through me in our kitchen. Not the confident tone from the sidewalk. Just tired. No, I said evenly. It was risk assessment. He exhaled through his nose. Almost a laugh. You always were dramatic. I'm precise, I corrected. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of the building's air system filled the silence. This contract would have stabilized us, he said finally. Investors were watching this one. Then you should have brought a stronger file, I replied. His jaw tightened. We rebuilt. We corrected everything. Then you'll survive without us. He studied me in a way he never had before. Not as a wife. Not as someone he controlled. As an equal. No, he said quietly. We won't. There it was. Not a threat. Not a warning. An admission. He told me investors had already pulled partial funding. That cash flow was tight. That rebranding bought time. But not forgiveness. Without a major public contract, the restructuring plan would collapse. I listened without interruption. Once, I would have felt vindicated hearing that. Once, I would have savored the reversal. Instead, I felt something steadier. You built a business model that depended on shifting risk onto other people, I said calmly. That's not resilience. That's leverage. He flinched slightly. You're different, he said. Yes, I answered. He hesitated before asking the question I hadn't expected. What happened to the $20? For a second, I saw the sidewalk again. The trash bag. The humid Georgia night pressing against my skin. His smile. I kept it, I said. He blinked.
Why?
As proof, I replied. That control is an illusion. He didn't argue with that. As he turned to leave, I added one more thing. Years ago, after the audit expanded, I invested in a small regional construction firm through a private equity fund. He paused. That firm is Northbridge. I continued. The one awarded today's contract. His expression changed. Not to anger, but to understanding. I hadn't sabotaged him. I had built alternatives. He nodded once, slowly, then walked away without another word. When the elevator doors closed behind him, I felt no rush of triumph, only release. I returned to my office and closed the door gently behind me. The late afternoon light stretched across my desk, catching the edges of framed certificates and compliance binders stacked neatly along the wall. In the top drawer, beneath neatly organized files, lay a folded $20 bill. The paper was softer now. Creased from years of being opened and refolded, I held it between my fingers for a moment. At 19, it had felt like a verdict. At 34, it felt like origin. I thought about the path between those two versions of me. The diner shifts, the nursing exams, the night studying compliance law at the kitchen table, the courtroom silence, the Christmas dinner, the boardroom vote, revenge. I realized had never been the point. Power was not the loud kind that throws someone onto a sidewalk, the quiet kind that builds credentials, protects patients, secures contracts, and signs paychecks. That evening, I called Evelyn. "It's done," I told her. She laughed softly on the other end of the line. "Good. Now build something even bigger." After I hung up, I stood by my office window overlooking the hospital parking lot. Families were walking toward the entrance. Nurses were arriving for night shift. Ambulance lights flashed faintly in the distance. This building mattered. The decisions inside it mattered. I mattered. Derek had believed $20 would send me back begging. He had believed humiliation was permanent. He had underestimated something far more dangerous than anger: patience. If you've ever been told you wouldn't make it, if someone handed you a small amount of money and expected your spirit to shrink with it, if you've ever been excluded, underestimated, or quietly written off as a failure, I hope you remember this. The greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's elevation. It's building a life so structured, so independent, so rooted in your own standards that the people who tried to define you no longer qualify as judges. If this story felt familiar in any way, I'd love to hear your experience. Share in the comments a moment when someone underestimated you and what you did next. And if you believe in stories about resilience, family drama, hidden strength, and turning the tables without losing your integrity, stay with me. Subscribe. There are more stories like this, real, raw, and rooted in transformation. He thought $20 would end my story. It only funded the first step.